My husband raised his glass at our 10th anniversary dinner and said, "Honestly, the best decision I ever made was marrying someone who wouldn't hold me back." His college friends laughed. His brother clapped him on the shoulder. I set down my fork, folded my napkin, and said, "Then you're going to love what I'm about to tell you." I walked out of that restaurant before the entrees arrived. 3 hours later, my phone lit up with a text from his best friend that changed everything I thought I knew about my own marriage. We'd booked the private dining room at Alara for our anniversary. My idea, my reservation, charged to the card I'd opened in my name before we were even engaged, because my mother always said a woman should have money nobody else can touch. 14 guests. A tasting menu I'd spent 2 weeks selecting with the chef. The kind of evening that looked effortless because I'd been managing effortless-looking things my entire adult life. My husband's name was Derek. Derek Holloway, who I'd met at a friend's rooftop party in Chicago 11 years ago when he was between jobs and reading a book about disruptive entrepreneurship that he carried everywhere but never seemed to finish. He was charming in the way that certain men are charming. Full of ideas, light on follow-through, the kind of person who could make a room feel like the most interesting place on earth until the room needed something from him. I was a licensed architect. I'd spent 6 years building a small firm that had just landed its first municipal contract, a community art center in Pilsen that would eventually be featured in Architectural Digest. I was 31, focused, quietly proud of what I'd built from a second bedroom and the used drafting table. Derek liked to tell people we were partners. In everything he'd say, "She's the blueprint, I'm the vision." People smiled at that. I used to smile at it too, back when I thought vision without execution was still worth something. By our 10th anniversary, my firm, Holloway Design Studio, had 14 employees, offices on the 18th floor of a building in the West Loop, and a project pipeline worth $8 million. Derek had tried 4 businesses in that same decade. A craft beer distribution startup that never got past the business plan stage, an events consulting company that lasted 7 months, a real estate wholesaling course he sold online for 6 months before the FTC sent a letter. Most recently, a premium men's wellness brand that had been in pre-launch for 2 years, which meant it existed as a logo on a laptop screen and a recurring charge to our joint account for software he described as essential. I had stopped asking questions about the wellness brand. I had stopped asking questions about most things. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from funding someone's belief in themselves for a decade, and by the time we sat down at Alara, I was tired in a way that had moved past feeling into something structural, the way a foundation settles. Derek was seated at the head of the table, his friends arranged around him like an audience. I was at the other end, close enough to hear everything which he had apparently not accounted for. I was talking to his college roommate's wife about a school she'd been considering for their kids when Derek's voice carried across the table during a lull in the music. "The thing about Lee is she's brilliant at execution," he was saying in the tone of someone explaining a limitation. "But she doesn't see the big picture. She never has. I've been carrying the visionary side of that firm for 10 years, and she's starting to act like it's hers." I went still. His roommate nodded slowly. "That's rough, man." "I've been talking to an attorney," Derek said. "If we ever split, I want to make sure my contributions to the firm are documented, my concepts, my introductions, my brand positioning." "Smart," said someone I'd known for 6 years, whose children had been in our home, who'd eaten food I'd cooked at holidays. "She'd be nothing without the vision I brought to the table," Derek said. "Nothing." I reached for my water glass. My hand was steady. Behind my ribs, something went very quiet, the way a city goes quiet right before a storm, not peaceful, just suspended. I put down the water, picked up my napkin, and looked at my husband from across the table we'd reserved together for an occasion meant to celebrate us. He was gesturing broadly now, enjoying his audience. He hadn't seen me watching. I stood up. The conversation nearest me paused. Derek looked up. "I need some air," I said pleasantly, the way you say something when you intend for it to be the last pleasant thing you say for a while. I picked up my clutch, smiled at the people closest to me, and walked out of the private dining room, down the hall lined with framed menus, through the bar where a couple was laughing over cocktails, and out through the glass doors onto the sidewalk on Randolph Street. The November air was sharp. I stood on the sidewalk and breathed it in and let it be sharp. I did not cry. I had spent the drive over that evening thinking about how lucky I was, how far we'd come, what kind of future we were building. That version of the evening had lasted about 40 minutes. I called my sister from the sidewalk. She answered on the second ring, already suspicious because I never called during dinner parties. "Don't go back in," she said, before I'd finished the first sentence. I wasn't planning to. I called a car. While I waited, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I recognized but didn't expect. It was Derek's best friend, Jonah. "Lee, I'm sorry. I've been trying to figure out how to tell you something for weeks. Call me when you can. Not tonight, whenever you're ready. But soon." I stared at the message for a long time. Then I looked up and watched the Friday night traffic move slowly down Randolph and thought, there it is. There's the rest of it. The car took me to a hotel I chose because it was close to my office. I needed, for reasons I couldn't fully articulate yet, to be near the thing I had actually built. I booked a junior suite, paid with the card nobody else knew about, ordered room service I'd barely touched, and sat in a bathrobe on the 16th floor looking at the city until my phone had so many texts from Derek that I turned it face down. His messages followed a predictable arc. First, the irritation. "Where did you go? This is embarrassing." Then the justification. "You took what I said out of context. You always do this." Then the performance of concern. "I'm worried about you. Please just come home." Then, when none of that worked, the warning. "If you do anything rash right now, you're going to destroy everything we've built." Everything we built. I sat with that phrase for a long time. I called Jonah the next morning, early, before Derek would have been awake. "I need you to tell me all of it," I said. There was a long pause. Then, "How much do you already know?" "About the attorney, the documentation, the plan to claim credit for the firm. I heard him last night." Jonah exhaled. "Lee, I should have called you 6 months ago. I've been telling myself it was going to blow over." That he was just venting, but it's more than that. He has a folder, an actual folder on his laptop labeled Firm Contributions. He's been saving emails where you CC'd him on things, screenshots of text where he offered an opinion, anything he can use to argue he was functionally a co-founder. I walked to the window. The city was gray and quiet, the way Chicago is on early Saturday mornings in November, streets still and cold and waiting. "Is there anything else?" Another pause, longer this time. "He pitched your biggest client last month. Separately, told them he was developing a consulting offshoot focused on brand strategy for architecture firms and that he'd be the primary contact going forward. I found out because the client's project manager mentioned it to my wife, who told me, and I've been sick about it ever since." I closed my eyes. My biggest client was a regional developer who had 3 projects in our pipeline totaling $4.5 million. I'd spent 2 years building that relationship. I'd flown to their Dallas office 4 times. I had redesigned a proposal from scratch over a single weekend when their board changed priorities at the last minute. Derek had attended 2 dinners with their team. He had been charming at both of them. "Send me everything you have," I said. "Every conversation, every detail you remember. And Jonah, I need you to be willing to say this to an attorney." "Yes," he said without hesitating, "whatever you need." I hung up and stood at the window for a long time. Then I opened my laptop and started making a different kind of folder. My attorney's name was Sylvia Park. I'd met her 3 years earlier at a professional women's network event and kept her card in my wallet ever since. The way you keep certain things because you hope you'll never need them and suspect that you will. She answered my call on the second ring even though it was a Saturday. "How long do you have?" I asked. "For you, all morning." I spent 3 hours with Sylvia that afternoon in her office, which smelled like good coffee and old books and had a framed print on the wall that said, "Well-behaved women seldom make history." I had always found that phrase a little too on the nose. That day I appreciated it. I brought everything I had: corporate formation documents, bank records, tax filings, client contracts, email chains, project timelines. I built the paper trail the way I build a structure, load-bearing elements first. Everything else supported by what came before. Sylvia went through it methodically. Her expression didn't change much, but I'd worked with enough professionals to know that stillness can mean many things. His name isn't on the LLC, she said. No. I formed the firm before we were married. He was never an owner. But he's been working in an advisory capacity? He had a business cards that said Creative Strategy Director for about 2 years. He attended some client dinners. He offered opinions. He was never compensated by the firm because he said he preferred to keep our finances clean. I paused. I accepted that explanation. Sylvia looked at me for a moment. How long have you been the sole financial support of your household? I did the math. About 8 years. She made a note. Over the following 3 weeks, I learned things about my marriage that rearranged its entire architecture. Jonah connected me with the developer's project manager, who confirmed that Derek had held 2 unauthorized meetings with their team. The project manager had declined to continue those conversations, but hadn't told me because, she said, she wasn't sure what she was allowed to say. She was sorry. I told her she had nothing to apologize for. Derek's laptop, which he left at home when he moved to his brother's house, contained the folder Jonah had described. It also contained a draft partnership agreement, presumably to be presented to me as a fait accompli at some point, arguing that Derek's strategic contributions entitled him to a 30% stake in the firm. There was a section on brand identity development that credited him with the firm's visual identity, which I designed myself over a weekend 7 years ago with help from a graphic designer I'd found on a referral. There was also a calendar. It showed meetings with 2 other clients in our pipeline. Introductory calls, his note said, for a new venture. Sylvia filed for an emergency injunction. We sent letters to every client in our active pipeline. I personally called each of them, 12 calls over 2 days, and told them clearly and without drama that Derek Holloway had no affiliation with Holloway Design Studio and no authority to represent the firm in any capacity. Every single one of them stayed. Several of them said they'd been confused by Derek's outreach and were glad I'd clarified. One of them, a hospital systems director named Art, said simply, "Lee, everyone in this industry knows who built your firm. It was never a question." I changed the firm's name while I was at it. Holloway had always been my name too, but I wanted to be done sharing it in a professional context. We became LK Design Studio. My middle name is Catherine. It was my grandmother's name. It felt like the right foundation for the next chapter. Derek's initial response to the legal proceedings was aggressive. He hired an attorney who sent a letter arguing that his decade of support, emotional, logistical, representational, constituted a material contribution to the firm's success and that he was entitled to equitable distribution. The letter specifically cited several client relationships as ones he had cultivated, including the developer whose project manager had just told me she'd been uncomfortable with his unauthorized contact. We included her written statement in our response. I sat through 2 mediation sessions. Derek arrived at the first one still wearing the watch I'd bought him for his birthday 3 years ago, a detail that registered somewhere beneath the surface and didn't resurface until later, when I understood it as the kind of small proprietary gesture that made sense, given everything else. At the second session, his attorney stopped the proceedings 15 minutes in and requested a private consultation with his client. They were gone for 30 minutes. When they came back, Derek's posture was different. He had the look of someone who has been shown, in specific and unavoidable terms, exactly what the evidence says. We settled 4 months after I walked out of Alara. Derek received his personal property, his car, and a structured payment of $40,000, not because he'd earned it, but because Sylvia advised that it was worth it to avoid the time cost of litigation. He signed a 5-year non-compete in the architecture and design consulting space. He relinquished any claim to the firm, its clients, its intellectual property, and its name. The day we signed, he was wearing a fleece and jeans. Not the kind of casual that signals confidence. The kind that signals that certain resources had dried up. He looked at me once, directly, and I saw something in his face that I recognized. The way you recognize a face in a crowd because you used to know it very well. "I convinced myself I was holding you together," he said quietly. Not defensively, just tiredly. I know, I said. That's the part that's actually sad. He left without saying anything else. My sister threw me a dinner party 2 weeks later. 12 people at her house in Logan Square, people who mattered, good wine, her husband's pasta that always tastes better than anything restaurant. Halfway through the evening, after the second bottle had been opened and the conversation had loosened, my oldest friend Bex held up her glass. "To women who do the work," she said. Someone else said, "And to finally having a table where we don't have to explain the work." I thought about that later, about how much energy I had spent over 11 years explaining myself in my own home, minimizing accomplishments so Derek wouldn't feel the contrast, crediting him in conversations where he hadn't been present, framing our life as a partnership in front of people who could see, if they looked, that the weight was distributed unevenly. I had done it out of love. I had done it out of habit. By the end, I'd done it out of a kind of muscle memory that had outlasted any real reason. I didn't do it anymore. 6 months after the settlement, LK Design Studio won a commission for a public library branch in the South Shore neighborhood, the largest public project I'd ever been awarded. The announcement ran in Crane's Chicago Business with a photograph of me in front of the site. My phone went off for 2 days. Messages from colleagues, former professors, clients, people I hadn't spoken to in years. One message came from a number I didn't recognize. I opened it. I saw the article, "Congratulations, I mean that." It was Derek. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I put my phone down and went back to the site plan I'd been reviewing. There are things you don't respond to, not out of bitterness, but because responding would require you to go somewhere you've already left. Jonah texted the same day, "Saw the Crane's piece. You deserve this, all of it." I thanked him. He testified in the mediation, given a written statement about everything he'd witnessed over those months, and done it with a directness that had cost him his friendship with Derek and, I suspected, some social friction in circles they'd shared for 20 years. His wife Rebecca had called me the week after the settlement to say she was proud of how I'd handled it. I told her I was proud of how Jonah had handled it. She said he is too now. It took him a while to get there. I thought about that, the getting there. How long it takes people to do the right thing, and what it costs them, and whether the delay negates the arrival. I hadn't fully resolved that question. I'm not sure it resolves cleanly. The library branch broke ground on a Wednesday in early March, one of those Chicago days that can't decide if it's still winter. I stood at the edge of the lot in my site boots and hard hat and watched the first excavation begin, the earth turning over in long, dark furrows. The community liaison stood beside me, a woman in her 60s named June who'd grown up 2 blocks away and had been advocating for this library for 11 years. 11 years, she said, looking at the equipment. I started this process the same year my husband passed. My kids told me it was too ambitious. She smiled. They were wrong. I thought about telling her that 11 years was significant to me too, for different reasons. I didn't because the moment wasn't about me. But I noted it, the way certain numbers come back around. Later that month, I spoke on a panel at a Women in Architecture conference. The moderator asked each panelist what advice they'd give to a young woman starting a firm today. Most answers were about capital, about mentorship, about mastering the business side alongside the design side. When it was my turn, I said, keep a bank account nobody else knows about. Not because you're planning for the worst, because financial independence isn't a backup plan, it's the foundation everything else stands on. You cannot build anything durable on ground that shifts when someone else decides to walk away. Afterward, a woman who looked about 25 came up to me. She was holding a notebook with a conference lanyard around her neck, and she had the look of someone who'd been thinking hard for a long time. My fiancé thinks we should combine everything when we get married, she said. All finances, joint accounts, the whole thing. He says it shows commitment. It can, I said. That's a real thing. But commitment and commingling are different categories. You can be fully committed and still have money that's yours. The two things don't contradict each other. She thought about that. Then, did you wish you'd done it differently? Any of it? I considered the question honestly, which is the only way to answer a real question. I wish I'd paid closer attention to what I was funding, I said. Not the money, the narrative. I spent years funding a story where he was the vision and I was the execution, and I let that story get told so many times in so many rooms that I almost started to believe it myself. She wrote something in her notebook. "What did you do when you stopped believing it?" she asked. "I walked out of a restaurant," I said, "and then I came back to my own building and I finished the work." She laughed, surprised. Then she thanked me and went back to her seat, and I went back to mine. And outside the conference windows, the city was doing what it always does, moving, building, making itself over, indifferent and magnificent and entirely unbothered by the people who underestimated it. The thing I keep coming back to, not with bitterness, just with the clarity that comes from enough distance, is how long I mistook loyalty for wisdom. I thought staying quiet about the imbalance was the generous thing to do. I thought minimizing what I'd built was kindness. It wasn't. It was a slow erosion of the kind of honest self-knowledge that protects you, and without it, you can spend the decade funding a fiction that eventually turns around and tries to take half of everything you are. Derek didn't start out as a villain. I want to be clear about that because the easy version of this story is that I married badly and finally wised up. The harder version, the true one, is that I participated in a dynamic I could see clearly and chose not to name. Every time I said we when I meant I, every time I let him accept credit at a dinner table and smiled instead of correcting the record, I was making a choice. I told myself it was gracious. What it actually was a slow surrender of the story of my own life. What changed things wasn't just walking out of that restaurant. It was what I did afterward. I called my sister. I called Jonah back when I was ready. I called Sylvia on a Saturday and told her everything. The intelligence wasn't in any single decision. It was in refusing to let shame slow me down. A lot of women in that situation spend weeks in paralysis, waiting to feel certain before they act. I made myself act first and let the certainty catch up. It always does, if you move toward the truth instead of away from it. Jonah is the piece of this I still think about most. He knew for 6 months. He sat at dinners, watched Derek take credit, heard the plans forming, and said nothing until the weight of it became more than he could carry. I understand that, even if I'm not fully at peace with it. There's a kind of moral courage that doesn't announce itself. It just shows up, late, and does what it should have done sooner. Jonah showed up. That matters. And what his wife Rebecca said to him, that if he could watch this happen to me, she'd never trust him not to do it to her, is the most important thing anyone said in this entire story. She understood that integrity isn't private. How you treat one person is a preview of how you're capable of treating anyone. What I know now, that I didn't fully know at 31, is that resilience isn't toughness. It isn't getting through hard things without showing damage. It's the willingness to keep building after you've had to tear something down. It's booking a hotel on a Friday night with a credit card nobody else knows exists, and sitting in a bathrobe looking at the city you love, and deciding, not dramatically, just quietly and firmly, that the story isn't over. It's just starting a new chapter with better structural integrity. I kept the foundation. I changed the name. I went back to work. That's the whole of it.